Thanks. So this paper, which essentially covers the late 19-teens until the early 1960s, is in some ways the kind of pre-story to the paper that Jim just gave. And I think you'll see some useful connections, too, to the papers on municipal bonds that we heard before lunch. It's part of what I hope will be a larger kind of book-length project, a history of public pension investment. I think, unlike anyone else in the room, am a historian. So the sources that I'm looking at, in addition to the kinds of publicly available data on asset allocations, are really about kind of getting into state and local archives and figuring out, in a kind of fine-grained way, how do government officials make investment decisions, and how do the frameworks in which they make those decisions change over time. So I think many of you know a lot about state and local government pensions. I hope maybe you'll come talk to me a bit later. The argument of this paper is that from the 19-teens until the late 1950s, state and local governments tended to invest under a framework that I call fiscal mutualism. And the idea here is that state and local officials, public officials, would invest public employee savings in public infrastructure by buying municipal bonds that build bridges and roads and schools and hospitals. This framework kind of worked up until about World War II. It came under strain during World War II and in the 15 years or so after. Pension officials kind of stuck with it until the end of the 1950s, and then it disappeared. And so part of the question that I'm interested in today is, when it worked, why did it work? And when it ended, why did it end? To explain that, first I'll talk a bit about the origins of this investment strategy within the kind of larger story of the origins of state and local public pension funds. I'll then talk about how this strategy was challenged during and after World War II, and eventually focus on how and why it ended in the late 1950s. I'll just mention now that the story that I'm telling largely builds on archival work with the New York City, New York State, and California pension systems. Those, during the period that I was interested in and down to the present, were the largest public pension systems in the United States. And so what they were able to do and the way that they operated was likely quite different than small municipal and county pensions that were operating at the same time. So funded pensions really come online in the 19-teens. You see earlier work at creating public sector pensions, but they were dramatically underfunded, and there's essentially a big crisis in New York City around 1916 when they figure out that the city has $200 million of unfunded pension liabilities, which in 1916 dollars is a really big problem. And so it's at that point when actuaries working for the city of New York begin to sort of develop plans for a fully funded, or what they understand to be a fully funded pension. And it's that model that's then picked up by city and state governments as they adopt public employee retirement systems in the future. When this happens, the enabling legislation almost uniformly imposes investment restrictions on public funds. These restrictions are often the same as those imposed on other regulated investments, so either those governing insurance companies, governing savings banks, or governing other forms of state investment, such as when states are investing sinking funds that they're later going to use to repay bonds. What this means is that public trustees are largely restricted to federal bonds and state and local bonds, usually within the sponsoring state, so the localism is effectively enforced. But even when they have broader opportunities available for investment, they're limited by sort of two further factors. One is trustee conservatism. So these funds tend to guarantee a rate of return between 3% and 4%, and trustees see their goal as to simply hit that return target and do nothing else to ensure or make sure that they can ensure that the principal of the investment remains secure. So they're very conservative in what they're investing in. And it's also limited by trustee expertise. So these are state and local government officials. To the extent that they understand any financial markets, it's their local bond market. And within the highly fragmented U.S. financial system, there's no reason you would expect, for example, that the comptroller of the state of New York would have any knowledge of California municipal bonds or Oklahoma municipal bonds or anything else. So there's investment limits, there are trustee conservatism, and then there's this kind of limited expertise within the funds. And this collectively creates the conditions for fiscal mutualism. Sometimes this operates as what I would think of as like soft or passive fiscal mutualism. So in California, public pension trustees are never explicitly tying investments to specific infrastructure projects, but they are exclusively investing in California municipal bonds up until the start of World War II. Alternatively, some public pension trustees take a much more active role. So the comptroller for the state of New York, Morris Tremaine, who I have quoted on the slide, explained his investment philosophy as follows. He says, "I have continued the policy of investing largely in the bonds of the municipalities of New York State, assisting them in procuring funds for needed improvements at a fair rate of interest when their financial condition warrants their borrowing." So as the comptroller of the state of New York, Tremaine has a sense of sort of local government finances. He's in a position to determine when their borrowing is justified, and he's using pension funds to actively invest in those particular municipalities. Now, this system of fiscal mutualism comes under pressure during World War II. Part of it is simply a story of patriotism, so public pension funds just invest in federal bonds. That's just what they do at the beginning of the war. But during the war, the Federal Reserve, in concert with the Treasury, holds federal bond rates to about 2.25%. And this makes it very challenging for public pension funds to meet this requirement that they return a 3 to 4% return for retirees. This means that every year, state governments or local governments have to make deficiency payments to make up the difference. During the war, municipal bond yields fall even further, in part because of a substantial increase in the level of federal taxation, which then, because they're tax-advantaged bonds, lowers the yields on municipal debt. And so immediately after the war, what we see is public pension funds, to the extent that they can invest outside of federal and local bonds, begin to do so as quickly as they can. So in New York, the New York State Fund sells off a lot of its municipal bonds and invests heavily in FHA-insured mortgages. In California, CalPERS or CalSERS at that time, can invest in public utility bonds, and so it shifts a large portion of its portfolio into public utility bonds. And so there's this real effort at diversification, and to the extent that funds are able to, they make this move. At the same time, and they recognize that municipal bonds are not an ideal investment because of the low returns. At the same time, you see, especially in the early 1950s, as the Federal Reserve decouples from the Treasury and begins raising rates, as corporations and households and states are competing for investment resources to build factories, to build homes, and to build public infrastructure, you see public funds continue to support municipal bond markets as a way to ensure that we can get the suburban infrastructure development that we want. And so in New York, for example, the pension fund is actively bidding on school bond issues, so competing with investment banks to buy the entire issue when a local government is trying to build schools. Later, they sort of shift stance where they're only buying the longest dated portions of those bonds, but the effort really is to keep municipal interest rates low and to try to balance the return needs of retirees with the demands, the financing demands of local governments. And so by 1959, 11% of the NYSERS portfolio is in school district bonds. And so you can see here, the first graph is essentially the wartime story, where we're moving from the yellow bars, which is state and local securities, to the blue bars, which is federal government debt. And then the bottom chart is the post-war picture, where you can see federal debt as a proportion of portfolios is shrinking. Municipal bonds is shrinking, but it's not going away. And then you see a substantial increase in non-governmental securities. And this chart just shows you the kind of absolute values of those categories as they go over time. So you can still see after the war, the yellow bars are increasing in size. So there's more investment in state and local bonds, even at a moment when these are lower yielding. It's not obviously a good investment, except insofar as it helps local infrastructure. And so the question is, you have this moment of tension in the 1950s, but by the 1960s, it's over. States and local governments emphatically stop investing in municipal bonds. And we can see the kind of tension and then the resolution through Arthur Levitt Sr., who was the comptroller of the state of New York from 1956 until 1980. You may be familiar with his son, Arthur Levitt Jr., who was the chairman of the SEC at one point. Levitt, on the one hand, is actively buying school bonds. And in the same sentence is often saying, I'm doing this, but I also need to be mindful of my obligation to achieve the highest return possible for retirees. This language, highest return possible, is not language that trustees would have used before World War II. Before World War II, under the sort of hyper-conservatism of that era, trustees really were just thinking about ensuring absolute safety and earning a reasonable return as a consequence. But by the early 1950s, by the mid-1950s, the language is around highest return possible. And so the question is, what changes to change this strategy or this sort of investment philosophy? One is a story of interest rates, right? This is the story of World War II. It takes a long time for pensions to get the legislative changes which enable them to diversify into higher yielding investments. But I think this experience during the wartime of reduced returns really sits with trustees for a long time. The second factor is a transformation in the legal philosophy of trust investment. So to some extent, this applies more to private pensions, which tend to be governed, or at least during this period, tended to be governed by state trust law. But anything that's happening in the private pension space is also influencing public funds. And you see a transformation from the prevailing sort of state-level trust rules up through the 1940s and 1950s of a legal list model, where trustees are given a list of securities that they're permitted to invest in, to a prudent man rule or a prudent investor standard, where trustees are meant to invest as a prudent investor, like situated prudent investor would. And that transformation moves from a focus on safe fixed income securities to a focus on more diverse investments. I think the third major change is the expansion of Social Security benefits to public sector workers. We've talked a lot about whether or not Social Security is functionally a welfare program. Certainly in the 1950s, they thought of it that way. And public employee pensions before the extension of Social Security had a similar function, right? This was public workers' only guaranteed retirement income. But once public workers are eligible for Social Security, that welfare function is taken care of, and public funds can then become more functionally a purely employment benefit, which can then encourage sort of greater risk-taking to ensure greater retirement, not just security, but prosperity for state workers. And then I think the fourth factor that's really important is the professionalization of investment. This happens both within funds. So as early as the 1940s, both CalPERS and NYSERS are hiring internal investment managers. They're primarily focused on municipal bonds, but they gradually develop expertise in other areas. And then as funds shift into new categories, they begin to hire external managers from firms like Moody's who are advising them on stock investments and other portfolio decisions. At the same time, these external advisors are urging pension managers to lobby for further liberalization. So often what would happen is states would enable funds to invest 10% of their assets in equities. And it's often the professional asset managers who say, it'd be better if you did 20%. Maybe you could get 20%. So there's a way in which private actors are shaping public policy through their investment advice and their sort of close ties to pension trustees. And so in the end, what we see, and this is essentially CalPERS and NYSERS balance sheets from 1957 until 1973. Data comes from the census. It's not super helpful in terms of what the non-government assets are. But you can see that in both funds, the yellow bar, which again is state and municipal bonds, essentially disappears as a part of public portfolios. And if you look at CalPERS' portfolio today, for example, it holds $0 in municipal debt. I had some questions, but I'll just look forward to hearing from you all. And thank you very much.